I found him just after 11 at night. I'd been checking Dylan's room before bed every night for the past 2 years, ever since his dad died. Just a quick look to make sure he was okay, that he was breathing, that he was there. It started as worry and became routine. Most nights I'd crack the door, see him asleep or scrolling his phone, and close it again. That night, the door was already cracked open about 6 inches, and his room was completely dark. I pushed it wider and saw him face down on his bed, still fully dressed in his school clothes. His left arm was hanging off the side, fingers brushing the carpet. Something felt wrong immediately because Dylan always slept curled up on his side, not sprawled like this. I touched his shoulder and said his name. Nothing. I shook him harder, and his whole body moved in one piece, limp and heavy. His skin felt cold under my palm. That's when I saw the pill bottle on his nightstand. It was my sleep medication prescription, the orange bottle with the white label that was supposed to be locked in the bathroom cabinet. I picked it up and turned it toward the hallway light. The label said 30 tablets. The bottle was empty. I screamed his name and grabbed my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped it twice before I could dial 911. The cord from my phone charger got wrapped around my finger and I had to yank it free. The operator's voice came through calm and steady, asking if he was breathing. I pressed my fingers against his neck the way she told me to, and I felt a pulse, faint but there. She said paramedics were 4 minutes out and to stay on the line, to tell her if his breathing changed. Those 4 minutes felt like an hour. I kept my hand on his back, feeling for the rise and fall of his chest, terrified it would stop. When the paramedics arrived, 6 of them came crashing through the door with equipment cases that banged against the walls. They tried a nasal spray first, something to reverse overdoses, but it didn't work because my medication wasn't the kind that spray could fix. They put a breathing tube down his throat right there in his bedroom and lifted him onto a stretcher. I tried to follow them to the ambulance, but they told me I couldn't ride with them because of protocol. I had to drive myself to the hospital, following their lights through empty streets at 2 in the morning. At the emergency room, they pumped his stomach and gave him activated charcoal to absorb whatever pills were left. Then they moved him to the intensive care unit. A doctor with tired eyes told me Dylan had taken around 30 tablets, that they got to him in time, but the next 48 hours were critical. He said it quietly, like he was trying not to scare me, but I heard what he meant. Dylan might still die. I sat in the ICU waiting room under fluorescent lights that hummed too loud. The chairs were hard plastic that stuck to my skin, and there was a vending machine in the corner making a clicking sound every few minutes. At 2 in the morning, I called my sister Lisa. She's older than me by 3 years, and she's always been the steady one, the one who helps. She picks Dylan up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays when I'm working late, takes him to movies, listens when he doesn't want to talk to me. I trusted her with him. I told her Dylan had tried to kill himself, that I'd found him an hour ago, that he was in the ICU. She said, "Oh my God," and that she was coming right away. Dylan had been struggling since his dad died 2 years ago. He was only 14 when it happened, a car accident that came out of nowhere on a Tuesday afternoon. We got him into therapy 18 months ago after his school counselor noticed he wasn't turning in assignments and was sleeping through classes. The doctor diagnosed major depression and started him on treatment and weekly sessions. Lisa had been a huge support through all of it. She's a school counselor herself, so I figured she understood what Dylan needed better than I did. The past 3 months, Dylan had been quieter than usual. He gave his Xbox to a friend, which I thought was generous. He stopped talking about college, which I assumed was normal grief avoidance because his dad had been so excited about Dylan going to university. Last week, he texted me, "Thanks for everything. Mom, you're the best," and I thought it was sweet. I didn't think it was a goodbye. 2 weeks ago, his therapist told me Dylan's mood seemed to be improving. I believed her. Dylan stayed unconscious for 36 hours. I didn't leave the ICU except to use the bathroom. There was a chair that folded into a cot, and I slept there in 20-minute stretches, waking up every time a machine beeped. Lisa came by every day with food I couldn't eat and sat next to me without saying much. On the 3rd day, around 10 in the morning, Dylan's eyes fluttered open. He looked confused at first. Then he saw me and started crying, saying I'm sorry over and over. I told him he was safe and that we were going to get through this. The medical team came in and stabilized him, adjusted his IV, checked his breathing. A social worker named Ms. Betrayal stopped by later that afternoon. She said it was county protocol for suicide attempts, that she needed to schedule an interview with me and with Dylan separately. I nodded and said, okay, but I still had no idea why this had happened. Dylan hadn't said anything except, "I'm sorry." I didn't know what he was apologizing for, or what I'd missed, or how I was supposed to make sure it never happened again. On the third day, at 2 in the afternoon, Miss Patel took me to a consultation room down the hall from the ICU. The walls were gray, and there was a tissue box on the table that looked like it got refilled multiple times a day. She asked the standard questions in a voice that stayed completely neutral. What was the home environment like? Had I noticed warning signs? How did Dylan access the medication? I answered everything honestly because I didn't have anything to hide. I told her I hadn't seen this coming, that he'd seemed better, that even his therapist said he was improving. I explained that the medication was supposed to be locked in the bathroom cabinet, that Dylan must have found the key I kept hidden in a linen closet. Ms. Patel wrote everything down without any expression on her face. She said they'd need to interview Dylan privately and that they'd be documenting statements from family members for their assessment. I said okay and went back to the hallway outside the ICU. I was folding one of Dylan's hospital gowns that a nurse had given me, standing maybe 10 feet from the nurse's station, when I heard my sister's voice. Lisa was talking to the nurse on duty, and her tone was loud and exasperated in a way that made me freeze. She said he did it for attention, that he was always dramatic, that this is what happens when you coddle them. She said my sister babies him because of the dad thing, but tough love is what he needs. The nurse's face stayed completely neutral, but her pen kept moving across the clipboard. She glanced at me for half a second, then back at Lisa. I walked over and asked Lisa what she'd just said. She stopped talking and turned to look at me. I asked again, quieter this time, "What did you just say?" Lisa got defensive immediately. She said she was just being honest, that I couldn't keep enabling Dylan or he'd do it again for attention. I told her he almost died, that they pumped 30 pills from his stomach, that this wasn't attention. She said, "That's what they want you to think." She said he knew I'd find him, that he timed it so I'd save him. The nurse interrupted and said she needed to finish her documentation. She walked away with the clipboard, and I watched her go, wondering what she'd written down. Over the next 2 days, Dylan was stable enough to move to the psychiatric floor for monitoring. They gave me a cot in his room, and I stayed there sleeping maybe 3 hours a night. I kept replaying the past 3 months in my head, looking for the things I should have seen. Dylan gave away his Xbox, and I thought he was being generous. He stopped talking about college, and I assumed he was avoiding the topic because it reminded him of his dad. He texted me thanks for everything, and I thought it was sweet. I didn't think it was goodbye. I kept asking myself how I missed all of it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty pill bottle on his nightstand. On the 5th day, Lisa came to visit and sat down in the chair next to my cot. She said I couldn't blame myself, but that I needed to set boundaries when Dylan came home. She said he needed structure, not coddling, and that our dad raised us with tough love, and we turned out fine. I was too exhausted to argue with her. I just nodded and stared at the floor. Later that afternoon, Ms. Patel asked to speak with me again. We went back to the same consultation room with the gray walls and the tissue box. She sat across from me and folded her hands on the table. She said my sister had made concerning statements to hospital staff. She asked me to tell her about Lisa's relationship with Dylan. I defended her automatically. I said Lisa had been helpful, that she was always there for him, that she picked him up from school twice a week and took him to movies. I said she was a school counselor and understood kids better than most people. Ms. Patel didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she picked up her pen and started writing in her notepad. She wrote for a long time, filling up half a page while I sat there wondering what I'd said wrong. She thanked me for my time and said she'd be in touch. I went back to Dylan's room and sat on the cot, staring at the wall. I didn't know what the social worker was documenting, or why Lisa's comments mattered so much, or what any of it meant for Dylan coming home. I just knew my sister thought my son had done this for attention, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was starting to ask if she was wrong about other things too. On the 6th day, Dylan was more lucid and started talking in short sentences. Miss Patel told me she needed to interview him privately, so I waited outside in the hallway, counting the floor tiles to keep myself from pacing. 45 minutes later, she came out. Her face looked more serious than it had during our previous conversations. She said Dylan had mentioned something important during their talk. She said he told her he'd left a suicide note, and she asked if I'd found one when I discovered him that night. I told her no, there was no note, that I would have seen it if there had been. She watched my face carefully and said Dylan was very specific about it. He said he left the note in his backpack and that his Aunt Lisa had been at the house that afternoon to pick him up from school. My heart dropped into my stomach. I stepped into the stairwell because I needed somewhere quiet to make the phone call. I dialed Lisa's number and waited while it rang 4 times. When she answered, I didn't bother with a greeting. I said, Dylan told his social worker he left a note in his backpack that she picked him up from school that day, and I asked if she saw it. There was a long pause. 15 seconds of silence where all I could hear was Lisa breathing on the other end. Then she said she didn't want to worry me. I asked her again, slower this time. Did you see a note? She said yes. But it was just teen angst, dramatic stuff, the kind of thing he writes all the time. Her voice had this defensive edge to it, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. My own voice was shaking when I asked her where it was. She said she threw it away, that she didn't think he'd actually do anything. I said the words very carefully. You threw away a suicide note? She said it wasn't like that he was being dramatic, that she'd seen this kind of thing with her own kids before, and they say things for attention. She said she was trying to protect me from enabling him, that if she'd told me about it, I would have overreacted and made things worse. I hung up without saying anything else. My hand was shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone. I went back to where Miss Patel was waiting and told her what Lisa had just admitted. Miss Patel's expression changed completely. Her jaw tightened and she asked me to repeat exactly what my sister had said. I told her Lisa found a suicide note hours before Dylan's attempt and didn't tell anyone. Ms. Patel said she needed to escalate this immediately. She said hospital security would be pulling footage from that day. The next morning, Ms. Patel took me to the security office. There were multiple monitor screens mounted on the wall showing different camera angles from around the hospital. The security supervisor was already sitting at the desk when we arrived. He pulled up the footage from the night of Dylan's attempt and started walking us through the timeline. He said my sister's car entered the hospital parking lot at 8:47 in the evening. That was 2 hours and 16 minutes before I called her at 11:03 to tell her what happened. The footage showed Lisa's car pulling into a spot near the emergency room entrance. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 8:47 p.m. She sat in the car without moving for 33 minutes. She didn't get out, didn't go inside, didn't call anyone. At 9:20, her car backed out of the spot and left the parking lot. She came back at 11:30, 27 minutes after I'd called her in a panic to say Dylan was in the ICU. The supervisor froze the frame on her car pulling back into the lot. He said your sister was here for over 30 minutes the night of the attempt. She didn't check in at the emergency room. She didn't call you. She just sat in her car and then left. I stared at the frozen image on the screen. The timestamp. The empty parking lot. Lisa's car with her sitting inside it. Ms. Patel turned to look at me and asked if I understood what this meant. I nodded because I couldn't speak. Lisa had found Dylan's note around 4 in the afternoon when she picked him up from school. She'd read it, decided it wasn't serious, and put it in her purse. Then hours later, something must have made her nervous enough to drive to the hospital. Maybe she'd second-guessed herself. Maybe she'd started to worry she'd made a mistake. But instead of coming inside or calling me or doing anything at all, she sat in her car in the parking lot for half an hour. And then she left. Dylan took the pills around 10 at night, 6 hours after Lisa found his note. I found him at 11:03. Lisa came back at 11:30 after I'd called her and acted completely shocked like she had no idea anything was wrong. Miss Patel said she'd be filing a report with County Child Protective Services. She said this went beyond poor judgment. She said my sister had evidence that Dylan was in danger and made a choice not to act on it. I asked what that meant for Dylan, if he could still come home with me. Miss Patel said the investigation would determine that, but her focus wasn't on my care of Dylan. Her focus was on understanding why my sister, who was supposed to be helping our family, had hidden a suicide note and then sat in a hospital parking lot knowing something was wrong. I went back to Dylan's room and sat on the cot. He was asleep, his breathing steady and even. I thought about Lisa reading his note, folding it up, putting it in her purse. I thought about her driving to the hospital hours later but not coming inside. I thought about her sitting in that parking lot for 33 minutes, and I wondered what she was thinking during that time. If she was convincing herself Dylan was being dramatic, if she was deciding it wasn't serious enough to bother me about, if she was choosing over and over again not to save him. 2 weeks after Dylan was discharged, he started an intensive outpatient program, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. He came home to sleep and lived with me under a new routine that felt fragile and careful. Therapy, 3 times a week, adjusted treatment plan, and the medication locked in a cabinet with a combination lock this time instead of a key. I hadn't spoken to Lisa since the phone call in the stairwell. She'd tried calling twice, but I didn't answer. On a Thursday afternoon, there was a knock on the front door. I opened it to find a man in his late 30s holding a county identification badge. He introduced himself as Mr. Rodriguez from Child Protective Services. He said this was a standard home visit following Dylan's hospitalization. I let him inside and watched him walk through the living room, taking notes on a clipboard. The house was clean because I'd been keeping it that way obsessively, washing dishes immediately after meals, vacuuming every other day. He asked to see Dylan's room. I took him upstairs and stood in the doorway while he looked around. Dylan's therapy workbooks were stacked on his desk next to his laptop. Mr. Rodriguez picked one up, flipped through a few pages, and set it back down. He checked the medication cabinet in the bathroom. I showed him the combination lock and explained that only I knew the code. He wrote something on his clipboard and nodded. Then he asked if we could sit down and talk. We went to the kitchen table, and he asked about my work schedule, Dylan's care plan, and Lisa's involvement with our family. I told him the truth. Lisa used to help with school pickups twice a week, but I hadn't spoken to her since the hospital. I didn't mention why, because I assumed he already knew from Miss Patel's report. Mr. Rodriguez said he needed to interview Dylan separately. I went downstairs to the kitchen and listened to the muffled sound of their voices through the ceiling. I couldn't make out words, just the low tone of Mr. Rodriguez asking questions and Dylan's higher voice answering. 30 minutes later, Dylan came downstairs and went straight to his room without looking at me. Mr. Rodriguez followed and sat back down at the kitchen table. He said my son was very clear about what happened. Dylan had written the note and left it on top of his textbooks in his backpack, visible and obvious. He'd hoped someone would see it and stop him before he did anything. Mr. Rodriguez said Dylan saw Lisa reading the note through a crack in his bedroom door. He watched her pick it up, read the whole thing, and then put it in her purse. She left the house without saying anything to him. Dylan waited 6 hours, and when no one came to help him, he decided no one was coming. I started crying and couldn't stop. Mr. Rodriguez slid the tissue box across the table and waited quietly until I could breathe again. He said I'd done everything correctly. Therapy, medication management, appropriate supervision. He said my sister's actions were the concern, not mine. Over the next week, Mr. Rodriguez collected documentation. Dylan's therapist sent over treatment plans and session notes going back 18 months. The hospital provided medical records about Dylan's father's death and the grief counseling that followed. The school sent attendance records and notes from counselor check-ins. Mr. Rodriguez came back the following Tuesday and sat across from me in the living room this time. He said, based on their investigation, there was no evidence of neglect or inadequate care in my home. He said I was cleared. Then he paused and said, however, and I felt my stomach tighten. He said Lisa's statements at the hospital had raised significant red flags. She'd dismissed a suicide attempt as attention-seeking while Dylan was unconscious in the ICU. She'd hidden a note that explicitly stated suicidal intent. She'd demonstrated extremely poor judgment about child welfare. He said they needed to assess her own household. I asked what that meant. He said Lisa had 2 children, ages 12 and 14. I nodded because I already knew that. He said the county would be visiting her home within the week to conduct interviews with her kids. I didn't know what to say. Mr. Rodriguez's face stayed neutral and professional, but I could tell this wasn't a minor follow-up. This was a full investigation. He said Lisa's profession made this more serious. She was a school counselor, someone trained to recognize mental health crises in children. The fact that she'd found a suicide note and not only failed to report it, but actively hid it, suggested a dangerous pattern of minimizing children's emotional needs. He asked if I had concerns about how Lisa treated her own kids. I said I didn't know, that I'd never noticed anything obvious, but I also admitted I hadn't been looking for it. Mr. Rodriguez wrote something down and then told me the county would keep me updated on their findings as appropriate. He said Lisa didn't know they were investigating her household yet, that they'd be making an unannounced visit. After he left, I sat on the couch for a long time. I'd been so focused on Dylan, on keeping him safe and getting him through the outpatient program, that I hadn't thought about what would happen to Lisa. Now the system that had been investigating me was turning its attention to her. And unlike my home, where everything had been documented and appropriate, I had no idea what they were going to find in hers. 4 weeks after Dylan came home, my phone rang at 7 in the evening. It was Lisa. I stared at her name on the screen for 3 rings before I answered. She didn't say hello. She said Child Protective Services showed up at her house and interviewed her kids at school without telling her first. Her voice was shaking with anger. She asked if I'd told them to investigate her. I said I didn't tell them anything. I said they made their own decision based on what she'd said at the hospital and what she'd done with Dylan's note. Lisa's voice got louder. She said this was insane, that she was a school counselor, that she knew child development better than some county worker with a clipboard. I told her she hit a suicide note. She hung up on me. 5 days later, Mr. Rodriguez called and asked if I could come to his office. When I got there, he said he could only share limited information because of confidentiality rules, but he wanted me to know the county had interviewed Lisa's children separately at their school. He said some concerning patterns had emerged during those interviews. I asked what kind of patterns. He said he couldn't share specifics, but emotional invalidation was a theme that came up multiple times. I drove home thinking about Lisa's kids. Her daughter was 14, the same age Dylan had been when his dad died. Her son was 12. I'd seen them at family dinners and birthday parties, and they'd always seemed fine. Quiet, maybe, but fine. A week later, Lisa's husband Mark called me. His voice sounded exhausted in a way I'd never heard before. He said he needed to tell me something that he should have told me weeks ago. He said he knew about Dylan's note. Lisa had shown it to him the night she found it. She told him it was just teen drama, told him not to worry me because I'd overreact. He said he trusted her judgment because she was a counselor, and he thought she knew what she was doing. I asked him if he understood what he was telling me. He said yes. He said he should have called me immediately, that he should have done something, but he trusted Lisa's professional opinion. Then his voice cracked. He said Child Protective Services had interviewed their kids, and the things his children said about how Lisa handled their emotions made him realize he didn't know his wife as well as he thought he did. He said he didn't realize how bad it was. Another week passed. The extended family found out what happened through my aunt, who'd heard it from my mother. The family group chat exploded with messages, people taking sides, asking questions, demanding explanations. My mother sent Lisa a private text that Lisa screenshotted and sent to the group chat. It said, "You hid a suicide note. You could have killed him. I can't look at you right now." Some relatives defended Lisa. They said she'd made a mistake, that she'd had good intentions, that families should stick together during hard times. Others sided with me. They said this wasn't a mistake. It was a choice she'd made over and over for 6 hours. The family split down the middle, and suddenly every holiday and birthday party for the next 10 years became a logistical problem. 2 weeks after that, Mr. Rodriguez called again. He said the investigation into Lisa's household had concluded, and while he still couldn't share everything, there were findings he was authorized to tell me because they involved Dylan's case. He said Lisa's 14-year-old daughter told the investigator that her mom says crying is manipulation. When she got upset about friend drama at school, Lisa grounded her for being dramatic and told her she needed to toughen up. Lisa's 12-year-old son said his school counselor had suggested he see a therapist for anxiety. Lisa told him therapy was for weak people and refused to make the appointment. Mr. Rodriguez paused, and I heard him flip a page in whatever file he was reading from. He said Mark had also given a statement to the county. Mark admitted that Lisa dismisses their children's feelings regularly. He said he'd enabled it for years because he didn't want conflict in the house. Mark told the investigator that Lisa called their kids dramatic when they cried, that she punished their daughter for having a panic attack at school because she thought the girl was faking it for attention. The county mandated family therapy once a week for a minimum of 6 months, monthly home visits, parenting classes for Lisa specifically focused on emotional validation and child mental health. Mark filed for separation the following week. He sent me a text that just said, "I can't enable this anymore. The kids deserve better." 10 days later, Lisa's employer got a copy of the CPS report. It's mandatory notification when a school employee is investigated for anything involving child welfare. The school district opened their own investigation into whether Lisa had violated professional ethics. They found that she had. A school counselor who dismissed a mental health crisis and hit a suicide note demonstrated conduct incompatible with student welfare responsibilities. They terminated her employment effective immediately. I found out through my mother, who called me crying. She said Lisa had lost her job, that Mark was leaving her, that the county was monitoring her parenting. She asked me if I was happy now. I wasn't happy. I was sitting on my couch next to Dylan, who was doing his therapy homework and seemed lighter than he'd been in months. I looked at him and thought about Lisa sitting in that hospital parking lot, deciding my son wasn't worth the effort to walk inside. I told my mother I had to go and hung up. 12 weeks after Dylan's attempt, Mark sent me a message asking if Lisa could meet with me. He said she wanted to talk, that she was asking to apologize in person. I thought about it for 2 days before I agreed, but only at a coffee shop in a public place where I could leave whenever I wanted. Lisa was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived. She had a stack of papers in front of her, printouts from the hospital with highlighted sections. She looked thinner than I remembered, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She pushed the papers toward me across the table and said she didn't realize they were recording what she said at the hospital. She thought she was just talking to the nurse, trying to help. I looked down at the printouts. I could see the highlighted phrases. Did it for attention. Always dramatic. This is what happens when you coddle them. I told her she said those things while my son was unconscious in the ICU after they'd pumped 30 pills from his stomach. She said she was trying to protect me from enabling him, that she thought tough love was what he needed. I asked her if she remembered our father. She looked confused by the question, so I reminded her. Our dad who told us crying was weak. Our dad who grounded us for having feelings. Our dad who said emotions were manipulation. I told her I'd spent thousands of dollars on therapy learning to undo what he taught me. I asked her if she really thought we turned out fine. Lisa's face went red. She said she made a mistake, but that I was destroying her life. Child Protective Services in her house every month. Mark filing for divorce. Losing her job. All because she hid one note. I leaned forward and said it quietly. You hid a suicide note. My son waited 6 hours for someone to save him. You chose not to. She said she didn't think he'd actually do it. Her voice was defensive, almost pleading. I told her that was the problem. She didn't think. She decided for him that he wasn't serious, that he didn't deserve help. I left $20 on the table for my coffee and walked out. 3 days later, I filed for a restraining order. The judge granted it based on documented impairment of judgment regarding Dylan's safety. Lisa wasn't allowed within 500 feet of my home or Dylan's school. 4 months after the attempt, Dylan was back at school part-time. He still had therapy 3 times a week, but he was talking more in sessions. Dr. Chen said he was making real progress. One afternoon, Dylan showed me something he'd written. He said it was a therapeutic exercise, a letter to Aunt Lisa that he wasn't going to send. I asked if he wanted me to read it. He said yes. The letter said, "You read my note and decided I wasn't serious. You didn't think I deserved help. That's the worst part, not that you didn't believe me, but that you didn't think I was worth the effort to check." I folded the letter carefully and gave it back to him. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound empty. 5 months after the attempt, an envelope arrived at my house with Lisa's return address on it. I almost threw it away without opening it because she wasn't supposed to contact me, but something made me curious enough to read it. The letter said she was in therapy now, court-ordered as part of the CPS monitoring plan. Her therapist told her she had her own trauma from our father's parenting. She said she didn't think Dylan was serious because she'd learned that feelings weren't serious. She wrote that she was sorry, that she knew I wouldn't forgive her and didn't deserve forgiveness anyway. But she was working on being better for her own kids. I showed the letter to my therapist at our next session. My therapist said I didn't owe Lisa forgiveness. She said Lisa was learning consequences, and that was separate from my healing. I put the letter in a drawer and didn't respond. 6 months after the attempt, Mark was awarded primary custody. He got the kids 80% of the time. Lisa had supervised visits only until she met specific therapy goals the court had outlined. My mother stopped speaking to Lisa entirely and started coming to our house twice a week to have dinner with Dylan and me. Dylan went back to school full-time. He joined a peer support group for teenagers who'd lost parents. He still saw Dr. Chen every week, and some days were harder than others, but he told me one night while we were watching TV that he was glad he was alive. He said he didn't think he would be. I didn't say anything. I just put my arm around his shoulder and kept watching the show. Later that night, after Dylan went to bed, I sat on the couch thinking about all the things I'd missed. The Xbox he gave away. The texts that seemed sweet but were actually goodbyes. The silence I mistook for healing. I missed things because I didn't know what I was looking at. But Lisa didn't just miss them. She saw them. She read them in Dylan's own handwriting, and she decided they didn't matter. There's a difference between oversight and dismissal, between missing warning signs and hiding evidence, between not knowing and choosing not to act. Lisa thought she was teaching tough love. She thought she was protecting me from enabling my son. But what she almost taught Dylan was that no one would save him, that his pain wasn't real enough to take seriously, that he wasn't worth the simple act of walking into a hospital or picking up a phone. The note wasn't dramatic. Her dismissal was. If you're listening to this and someone in your life tells you they're thinking about suicide, whether through words or notes or behavior, believe them. Don't decide for them whether they mean it. Don't wait to see if they're serious enough. Don't convince yourself it's just for attention. My sister sat in a hospital parking lot for 33 minutes knowing something was wrong, and she chose to leave. 6 hours separated Dylan's note from the pills he swallowed. 6 hours where one phone call could have changed everything. Dylan survived because I found him in time. But he shouldn't have needed luck. He needed someone to believe him when he asked for help. Thank you for listening to this story. If it meant something to you, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. We share a new story every day, and sometimes hearing about other people's experiences helps us make sense of our own. Take care of yourselves and each other.